Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of this hour. The United States and Armenia have agreed to cooperate on civil nuclear energy, deepening ties. The move follows a US-brokered South Caucasus peace deal, with Washington seeking to draw Yerevan closer. A US judge blocks the deportation of Rumsia Öztürk, a Turkish student at Tufts University, according to her lawyers. The decision is filed at a federal appeals court after her arrest during a crackdown on pro-Palestinian activists. Hong Kong's leader John Lee praises the 20-year sentence given to pro-democracy media tycoon Jimmy Lai, calling his crimes severe. The United States, United Kingdom and the United Nations condemn the jailing as unjust and urge his release on humanitarian grounds. Jeffrey Epstein associate Ghislaine Maxwell appears virtually from a Texas prison and refuses to answer the U.S. House Oversight Committee. Chair James Comer says she invokes the Fifth Amendment, blocking questions on Epstein and possible co-conspirators. US President Donald Trump opposes Israel's annexation of the occupied West Bank as international criticism grows. The White House says a stable West Bank is key to Israel's security and regional peace. The United Nations says it is awaiting clarity on how much of nearly $4 billion in arrears the Trump administration will pay and when. UN chief warns of imminent financial collapse as the US confirms it plans a partial payment in the coming weeks. French President Emmanuel Macron says Europe must prepare for further confrontation with the United States. He warns Washington could target the EU over digital rules and tariffs, saying the Trump administration is increasingly hostile to Europe. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu heads to Washington to urge President Trump to expand nuclear talks with Iran as US military pressure builds. Israel wants to curb Iran's enrichment, missiles and regional proxies, while Tehran rejects those demands without sanctions relief. We start with some breaking news coming out of the Middle East, and Iran has issued a stark warning about the potential destructive impact on diplomacy ahead of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's upcoming visit to the United States. This warning signals escalating tensions in the region as Netanyahu prepares for high-stakes discussions with US officials. In related developments, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Larijani, has arrived in Oman for said talks. His visit follows the recent resumption of nuclear discussions between Iran and the US in Muscat. Larijani is set to meet with Oman's Sultan Haitham bin Tariq and Foreign Minister Badr bin Hamad Al Busaidi, and the talks are expected to focus on regional issues and strengthening economic ties between Iran and between Oman. Joining us to discuss this related development is Professor Rohan Gunaratne, an international affairs expert. He joins us live from Singapore. Professor Gunaratne, thank you so much for joining us. It is always a great pleasure. Gearing up to these talks, indirect talks, of course, between Iran and the United States. There is a meeting first. Now, this will be the 6th meeting between President Trump and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu during Trump's second tenure as president. Iran's warning here, is it aimed more at Washington or is it aimed more at Tel Aviv? And does it suggest Iran believes the United States is losing control over Israel's Iran policy? Is Iran concerned that the United States will be influenced going into these talks, and the talks will be thrown off the course that they were already on?
Thomas, Iran is very much aware that the United States and Israel is working together. Last month, the US Department of War released their national defense strategy, in that Israel was identified as America's model ally in defense. So the world knows this close nexus. And as you rightly said, this is sixth visit of Netanyahu to meet with Trump during Trump's second term. And many Iranians are saying that this is not a visit to discuss about negotiations between the US and Iran, but a strategy for Israel and the US to plan strikes against Iran to remove the current leadership of the regime. But what I would like to say is that the visit of Ali Lajnani, the chairman of the National Security Council of Iran today to Oman, suggests that the Iranians want these talks to continue, because they know that if there is no talks, if the talks cannot be protracted, then of course the United States will strike, because US has huge military buildup in the Middle East surrounding Iran. So it's a question of that US is going to strike Iran sooner or later, because Iran is not agreeable to discuss about the missile, shutting down the missile program. It is agreeable to discussing about the fissile or the nuclear program, but it is not agreeable to discussing about the missile program or Iran's support for the proxies. And of course, the protests, because the US is very keen to get assurance from Iran that it will not harm or hurt the protesters, when such a large number of protesters have now been killed, maimed and injured, or are incarcerated.
Professor Gunaratne, we've seen talks between the United States and Iran before this. They were thrown off when Israel attacked Iran back in June in that 12-day war, which of course concluded with the bombing of Iranian nuclear sites by the United States. Now, just a couple of days ago, Israeli officials publicly warned that Israel would strike Iran unilaterally if Tehran crosses this red line when it comes to its ballistic missile program. Now, we don't know what that red line necessary is as of yet, but do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu's visit here risks poisoning these talks before they've even matured?
Certainly it can happen, and as you very rightly said, Israel did say that unilaterally Israel will attack Iran in the event missile program is not included in the talks between the US and Iran. And of course, Israel doesn't trust the Iranians. Israel is expecting there to be what you call intrusive inspections, meaning that inspectors from other countries, including the Atomic Energy Agency, will visit Iran to inspect whether nuclear proliferation is continuing, whether the missile program has been shut down. So I think that it is very unlikely that these talks are going to anyway produce positive results. My personal view is that the US sooner or later will strike Iran. Of course, replacing the regime in Tehran is a very difficult challenge, and everyone is looking how they are planning to do it, how the Americans are planning to do it. But looking at the military buildup, I believe that it's a major buildup. We have never seen such an unprecedented buildup before, and I personally believe that the talks are just to convince everyone, look, we have had a discussion, and that these discussions are not going anywhere because Iran is unwilling to compromise on their nuclear enrichment program, and on their missile program and on their support for proxies and on their position with regard to the protesters.
Professor Gunaratne, I want to focus in on one issue. Of course, Iran did say yesterday that it is willing to dilute its enriched uranium if sanctions relief was provided. However, it didn't specify which sanctions it would be. But moving on from that, in terms of the ballistic missile program, Iran has approximately 3,000 ballistic missiles. It's widely cited as the estimate for Iran's inventory, short and these medium ranged ones. Iran hasn't necessarily directly attacked any country provocatively since Iraq and since Pakistan, in 2024. Why can't Iran have ballistic missiles? There's no country on earth which, of course, is banned from having these missiles. Is that not a form of national security for Iran in a volatile region? And what negotiations will Israel and the United States put forward in order for them to get that number down?
The main concern of Israel and other countries in the Gulf especially is that Iran is providing the missile capabilities to the Lebanese Hezbollah, to the Yemeni Ansarullah, what you call the Houthi movement, then the Iraqi Hashd-e-Sha'b, and various other proxies. Of course, Iran itself has a huge missile capability, as you mentioned, and Iran has used those missiles against Israel most recently. And of course, Israel, although they have a very good theater missile defense capability, they are very concerned that there can be a breach of their shield. So I think that right now the concern is the Middle Eastern allies and friends of the United States. They have expressed their interest to the United States to include Iran's missile program, and to ensure that there is a rollback on that program because of the severity of the threat. The Houthis received Iranian missiles and they struck both Saudi Arabia and UAE. So that is why this concern is there over the missile program, in addition to the military nuclear program, where Iran was enriching the uranium to a point that would enable them to have a functional nuclear weapon.
Professor Rohan Gunaratne, thank you so much for joining us here on NewsX World. We'll, of course, continue to keep you updated on that Benjamin Netanyahu meeting as it proceeds those talks in Oman between the United States and Iran. But we move on now and over to Europe, and the French President Emmanuel Macron is calling on Europe to step up investment in strategic sectors, warning the continent risks being swept aside by competition from the United States and China. In an interview with several European publications, The Economist and the Financial Times, Macron said US threats and intimidation are not over and cautioned European leaders against complacency. Ahead of a key European Union meeting, Macron called for simplifying and deepening the EU's single market to make it more competitive. He also urged the bloc to diversify its trade partnerships to reduce dependence on major powers. The comment highlights growing concerns in Europe over its economic and strategic position in an increasingly competitive global landscape. Joining us to discuss this is Dr. J.D, a former Secretary of Commerce and Senior Economist, joining us live from New Delhi. Thank you very much for joining us. We take a look at the continent of Europe, especially under the Trump administration. Of course, it has faced tariff threats, sovereignty threats, verbal threats from the US president and his administration, particularly in that national security strategy doctrine, which highlighted some of Europe's economic woes. The French president here using strong words, some would say some provocative words towards the US president, all defensive, however you might want to put it. Is Macron right in that Europe is being swept aside, or is this political rhetoric masking Europe's own reluctance to reform? Is Donald Trump making Europe wake up to that?
Thank you for having me in this discussion.
Pleasure.
I don't think that President Macron is too far off the truth. The fact of the matter is that in the last 1 year, the US has not treated its European partners as strategic allies since the Second World War for 80 odd years, as well as during the World War.
Okay, I believe we are having some network issues there with Dr. Dewar. Hopefully we get him back in just a second to discuss this. The French president there sounding an unusually blunt alarm, claiming that Europe risks strategic and economic marginalization unless it dramatically scales up investment in critical times and fixes its internal market. He gave these interviews to the Financial Times and The Economist. So some strong words there. Unfortunately, we're not joined once again by Dr. Dewar, but we are moving on to our next story. We stay in Europe next, and Norwegian police have launched an investigation into two prominent diplomats, Mona Juul and her husband, Terje Roed Larsen, over suspected corruption ties to their connections with the late Jeffrey Epstein. Juul, who resigned as Norway's ambassador to Jordan and Iraq, faces allegations of gross corruption, while Roed Larsen is suspected of complicity. The investigation follows the release of millions of pages of the Epstein-related files, revealing financial and personal ties between the couple and the disgraced financier. These include plans for a possible visit to Epstein's private island in 2011, and Epstein's involvement in helping the couple secure a property deal in 2018. Meanwhile, Roed Larsen's lawyer insists that there is no criminal liability, while Juul's lawyer emphasizes her innocence, with both diplomats cooperating with authorities. Joining us now is Major General Sudhakar G, a senior strategic and international affairs expert, joining us live from Jaipur. Thank you very much for joining us. We've spoken about this before. Norway seems to be a country that has been in Jeffrey Epstein's orbit pretty closely. We've seen the Crown Princess exchange flirtatious emails even with Jeffrey Epstein. We've seen him entangled with the former chief of the Nobel Committee, a former Prime Minister. However, the Norwegian authorities seem to be taking this very much seriously, opening investigations where it deems appropriate. How do you analyse this in the way that the Norwegians are tackling this, and how would you compare that with the way that the Americans are?
Good afternoon, Thomas. Thank you for inviting me for your show. As regards the question, I think that's the way to go. Norway has always been a role model, and I would say putting up kind of a ideal kind of course of action on morality, on ethics, on moral turpitude, on character. And one has been looking at the Nordic countries with very high expectations, but for this turn of event which is taking place now, I'm glad and very happy that the government of Norway is taking it up seriously, and they have ordered a very serious investigation to look into the matter and take steps within the country itself. When you compare the steps taken by Norway with America, I think America has a lot of catching up to be done by the country, and it's very unfortunate that it is taking place on the soil of USA, which is still the superpower of the world, rules-based international order. And but for this particular incident, I have my very big questions coming to my mind with regard to the character and the morality of this superpower, which has been indulging in practices like tariff and very punitive measure and compounding the global geopolitical churn, which everyone seems to be suffering, whether it is price rise of fuel, fertilizer, or you talk about anything else post-pandemic. There has not been any initiative by America to introspect within and take corrective measures as a long-term step and course of action. Back to you, Thomas.
So we've discussed this, of course, several times from different angles. We know that there is plenty of information that still hasn't been provided by the US Justice Department. Is this Epstein falling out turning into a sort of global reckoning of elite networks, where even somewhere like Norway doesn't remain untouched?
Absolutely, Thomas, you're spot on. In fact, that is what I also have been inferring, that at times it gives an impression as if there is some third party which is conspiring this thing to happen, penetrate into the very fiber of a society. And that fiber, one was always thinking that it would remain restricted to USA, but now it is gradually fanning out. You have from the royal family of the United Kingdom, Andrew's name is there. Here is Norway, the former prime minister who also was heading the Nobel laureate team once upon a time. Now you have an ambassador and her husband, and they have been there in their lifetime in occupying very high places. And likewise, you have host of other people from Europe itself. You never know, Zelensky's name was there. And all these things have to be comprehensively investigated, both by United States as to how did this happen? How could a superpower allow an establishment like this to be encouraged and be fostered, and the system didn't know? This is shocking and surprising. So therefore, that is one part. The other part is whoever belongs to whichever country, the country also has a role and responsibility to investigate in order to, cleanse their system, in order to sanitize the system so that it doesn't happen in future. This is hoodwinking the existing architecture of rules-based order. And what happens to the future generation? We need to think about the future generation. What are we leaving behind? Do they have to come back to a country like India to learn about the morality or the ethics, or a country like that and learn Buddhism? Maybe Buddhism is going to put them in the right perspective. So we need to look into all these aspects in a comprehensive manner. Maybe the time has come. This is worse than the ongoing conflict, let me tell you, in Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine war. If the character of individual is held in question who are ruling the people, then it is worse than the conflicts which are going on. We need to pay more attention and focus on the issue. Back to you, Thomas.
And of course, a lot of the countries you've mentioned, the United Kingdom, Norway, the United States, France, have a lot of officials involved in this, mentioned in the files. These countries, they all push anti-corruption agendas internationally. Do you think this could weaken the authority, the moral authority of these countries?
That's what, Thomas, again, spot on. You have raised a very important issue. That's what because everyone has been saying the Cold War 1.0 was that of bipolar world. Cold War 2.0, unipolarity, proved beyond doubt about its ineffectiveness. So if it is proven, its ineffectiveness has been proven. The multipolarity is on full swing now, which Donald Trump is not prepared to accept. It's trying to push the agenda for G2. So is there any invisible force behind trying to collapse the transatlantic architecture and the relationship more rapidly than it is happening? Because this is making me become suspicious about the third force, which is not visible. Maybe some kind of a clandestine activity is going on, but behind those activities, what lies is the central responsibility of governance. The central responsibility of governance by any party is to ensure that the law and order is to ensure that there is a discipline within the family, between the couple, and every individual of a country. Are they following the right path? Or that right path has been left to the individuals to be decided, like the gun culture. There is an article, there is a constitution amendment, second amendment, which has taken place. Is that end all and be all? Similarly, when it comes to moral turpitude and character, I think the government of United States of America, the whole world order, has to sit down. Maybe United Nations also has to play a very important role. Back to you, Thomas.
Major General Tsitsernakaberd, thank you so much for taking the time in joining us. I'm sure we will talk about this once again as more revelations are revealed. We now move on to our next story and over to the Indo-Pacific. An Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, says that he is devastated by the violence and urged protesters to express their views peacefully. This comes as thousands of people gathered across Australia to protest Israeli President Herzog's visit, with clashes erupting between protesters and police. Meanwhile, New South Wales Premier Chris Minns defended police actions after the unrest, stating that officers were trying to prevent further violence. Protesters saw the use of tear gas and pepper spray, with 27 people also being arrested. Let's listen in to what the New South Wales Premier Chris Minns had to say.
What you saw last night was New South Wales Police being confronted multiple times by a section of that crowd intent on disturbing and disrupting police lines. Now, what we can say today that we couldn't say yesterday is that we had concurrently 7,000 mourners down at the International Convention Centre who were mourning the horrible events of the 14th of December with the President of Israel. New South Wales Police had to keep both protesters and mourners separate, so that as disturbing as the scenes were last night on the news, they weren't even worse as a result of thousands of people clashing together on the streets of Sydney.
We move on once again, and US Vice President J.D. Vance has visited the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan, where he took part in a wreath-laying ceremony. Vance is on a two-day visit to Armenia, and his trip comes just 6 months after Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders signed an agreement at the White House, which has been seen as the first step towards peace after nearly 40 years of war. Meanwhile, Armenian Prime Minister and Vance have said that Armenia and the United States agreed to cooperate in the civil nuclear sector. Some news from the sporting world now, and the India versus Pakistan T20 World Cup match, originally boycotted by Pakistan, is now back on the table after the government of Pakistan gave its green signal to Salman Ali Akka's team to take field in the Group A clash against India. The Pakistan government has officially given the green light for their team to take the field following a resolution with the International Cricket Council. The decision came after high-level talks with the ICC and the Bangladesh Cricket Board, addressing previous concerns regarding the hybrid hosting model and the participation terms. We turn once again to the Korean Peninsula, and South Korean authorities say e-commerce giant Goupyang must fix serious vulnerabilities in its security systems after a massive data breach that exposed personal information of more than 33 million customers. Announcing initial findings of a government-led probe, the Science Ministry said the leak was caused by a former Goupyang engineer who was aware of weaknesses in the company's authentication system. Officials said records show the individual attempted to access the system months before the breach, which began in April and continued until November. The incident is one of South Korea's worst data breaches and has heightened trade tensions with Washington after US officials raised concerns over the treatment of American tech companies. Investigations by police and data protection authorities are still underway. Goupyang has said payment and login details were not compromised.
조사단은 공격자가 쿠팡 서버에 인증 취약점을 악용하여 정상적인 로그인 없이 이용자 계정에 비정상 접속하여 정보를 무단 유출했음을 확인하였습니다. 위 변조된 전자출입증을 활용한 비정상 접속 행위가 발생했음에도 해당 공격 행위를 통한 정보 유출을 차단하지 못하였습니다. 또한 접속 기록을 일관된 기준 없이 저장 관리하여 페이지 이용자 식별과 정보 유출 규모 산정에 어려움이 발생하였습니다. 쿠팡은 정상 발급 절차를 거치지 않은 전자출입증에 대한 탐지 및 차단 체계를